Hello and welcome to Pagabo Live, a new initiative designed to promote knowledge in the public sector. My name's Tom, and over the next hour or so, we'll be talking about decarbonising your estate through effective estates management. And I'm joined by a panel of industry experts.
Hi, folks. I'm Stephen Gale, Group Construction Director at Cost Group Services. We are a multifaceted business that do commercial office interiors, commercial office furniture, build-to-rent furniture, and decarbonisation.
Hi everyone, I'm Matt Osborne. I'm the head of furniture at AIS. We are an international group of companies specialising in office fit out from all elements from design, construction, furniture, through to day two services as well.
Hello everybody, I'm John Morehouse. I'm CEO of Constructive Thinking Architects. We're based in Liverpool, working nationally. We're sustainability driven. We've been working in the decarbonisation sector for about 15 years.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Stephen, Matt and John. As usual, today's event is going to be a Q&A session. So we'll be going through some of the key talking points around government targets, how they're going to be funded, the age-old battle of sustainability versus cost, and obviously the varying role of retrofit furniture and architecture within decarbonisation. We'd also love to hear from you as the audience, so get involved by using the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. What you can do there is pop in a question for anyone or all of our panelists, and we'll hopefully get to those towards the end of the session. We're also going to be running polls as usual throughout the session, so make sure you're answering those, and that will help guide the conversation that we are having. And right on cue, the first poll should be coming up on your screen now. We like to do this at the start of every session to kind of gauge where people's level of understanding is at, and hopefully we'll do it at the end as well and show that we've grown some public sector knowledge today. So how aware are you of the different ways to decarbonise your estate through effective estates management? Scale of 1 to 4, 1 being not very aware and 4 being very aware. Give another 10 seconds on that poll just to make sure that as many people answer as we can get. And then we will run through the answers. In fact, if you can close that poll now, please, guys, so we can see the answers. And as you can see, we've got a fairly good base level of knowledge there. People in that kind of 2 to 3 in terms of levels of awareness, which is an excellent starting point. But let's see if we can get those up some 4s by the end of the session. So we'll bring on our first question. And what we'll do is we'll put this to John to start off with. What targets are that the government has set around net zero? A nice broad opening question for us to get going.
Well, it looks as though we've got quite an enlightened audience, so you'll probably already know the headline figures and dates. But the UK government aims to cut emissions by 78% by 2035, compared with 1990 levels. So they do have a starting point and a potential end point. And then they add on the way to reach net zero by 2050. But they don't quite define what net zero is. Really, we're looking across 5 sectors, and we're going to focus in on the built environment, but those sectors include agriculture, transport, industry, built environment, of course, and energy systems. Global statistics show that the built environment only really impacts on a small amount of total carbon output. But as a very developed and dense island, the UK is slightly different. And statistics suggest that our buildings account for 17% of UK emissions. So think of it as a fifth of those 5 characteristics I described. And within that, actually, I was surprised when I looked these figures up for the seminar, because I thought it was around 50-50, but 77% of our carbon output from the built environment is in the domestic sector, 14% in commercial, and 9% in public sector. So public sector, we're looking at about 10% of 25%, but it is impactful, and all of these areas are linked. They don't really exist in isolation. And it's interesting to note that the government really started its big attack on carbon output on the domestic market, but the lessons learned from us as designers and solutions providers, and the lessons learned from the government, are very much informing where we're going to be going by 2035. And I did hear that the MEES, the abandoned MEES plan of lifting all commercial properties to EPCC is being brought back in, if it's not been brought back in already. So that really outlines the targets and gives us a bit more of an understanding of where we need to get our own buildings to. The time limit on that was 2030. I've got a feeling that's going to be relaxed, but not by much.
Excellent. So that's the situation as it is, the challenge as it were. So what, again, we'll go to you with this one, John, what decarbonisation funding is there available to the public sector for reducing that, that 9% of the 25% that we've talked about?
Well, there's three key schemes at the moment, depending on whether we're in England, Scotland or Wales. I don't know if we've got any Northern Ireland delegates here, but if we have, I don't know which scheme is applicable to Northern Ireland, but maybe we can raise that in the questions and answer it. So in England, we actually have two funds, and the first is it's called Phase 5 Low Carbon Skills Fund. Most of these funds are accessible via the SALIX mechanism. And this isn't to decarbonise buildings, but it's to put us in a position where we understand what we want to do with our specific buildings. If you like, it's funding to help you prepare a bid. And then the Phase 4 Public Sector Decarbonisation Scheme is the next one along the line. I have a feeling that these schemes are favoured if you've attracted low carbon skills funding, but it's not exclusively that. The bids are quite tricky, and they're along the lines of most of the DESNZ bids. There is an element of design that needs to be in there, design-led thinking. There's an element of understanding what your baseline is, and there's also then an element of understanding how much you're going to decarbonise a building by, how much it's going to cost and how long it's going to take. So they're the two schemes, one prepares for the other. In Wales, there's Decarbonising, which is similar but more straightforward. I should probably just circle back to the England scheme. Historically, it's been like trying to buy Glastonbury tickets. It comes online early in September at 9 in the morning, and they take bids until the funding's gone. They've learned from that, and I think going forward in the future, it's going to be slightly more equitable. Of course, Wales far ahead of England on sustainable thinking. That's almost a rolling bid. And then Scotland has the aptly named Scotland Public Sector Heat Decarbonisation Scheme. All of these tend to be on rolling programs of a year, but what I see in the industry is our application to public buildings, and in the future to commercial buildings, because I think this offering will be rolled out in some ways to the commercial sector, tends to follow lessons learned from the domestic sector. And those of you with any domestic stock and experience here will probably be aware that the housing decarb schemes have been running for 4 years in their current form, and we're just up to another rollout. And what I've seen in that sector is each scheme becomes slightly more nuanced and builds on feedback from the previous ones. So if you're new to these bids, do expect them to be difficult at first. Part of the reason for funding is to build a supply chain, build a capability, and build an understanding, so that each set of projects that we take forward are better informed and more deliverable.
Stephen, I saw you nodding along there when John mentioned how difficult these can be at first. Anything to add there on the kind of the funding that's available to the public sector?
I think they're the key funds. There are other funds available. You really have to dig about from them. There are also, what I should add actually, and I'm not making a plug for them, but they have been very useful. Turner and Townsend is an organisation that the government quite often uses to give advisory help to bidding for carbon schemes, and then assistance running through delivering them. So it's worth engaging with Turner and Townsend and similar organisations.
So, Stephen, we'll go over to you with this one. What advice can we give on how public sector clients, many of whom will be in the audience today, what advice can we give them in terms of planning for net zero?
Well, with regard to cast contracts, we're sort of specialists in decarbonisation, specifically the retrofit element. So we will focus on typically buildings or assets that need to have decarbonisation interventions implemented. We would typically follow the PAS 2038 sort of framework. And what I would say is, with regard to the various sort of asset managers, landlords, and any public sector clients, really just focusing on following that framework. So there's the assessment, which is an absolutely vital part. So looking at your asset, being able to identify the EPC rating and its current performance, then looking at how you want to potentially implement the decarbonisation strategy. So that element of planning, being able to evaluate where it currently is and assessing what interventions will work best is obviously sort of key to developing a strategy to move forward. The implementation part of that, I think, is probably where we come into our own as a sort of main contractor and builder, is that often what I tend to find with these schemes is there's a huge amount to consider, specifically public sector. So where John was mentioning about some of the targets earlier on with regard to net zero, some of those interim targets, the government have slightly relaxed some of the targets on the public sector element. So I think it's 50% by 2032 carbon reduction and 75% by 2037, which is slightly, very slightly less and a bit more forgiving than what some of the other private sectors have to follow. And that's based around the fact that public sector buildings can inherently be very difficult. So you've got schools, you have hospitals, you have a number of, primarily a lot of it's defense, storage. So I think with regard to that and the nature of the public sector buildings and the fact that a lot of them are quite old, budgets will be very tight. I think getting a good team together is absolutely pivotal. So ensuring that your consultants, architects, all have the relevant experience and knowledge is quite key. Ensuring that everybody has a good understanding of the strategic goals and how to get there. We've been involved in a number of schemes that initially start with the intention of driving massive decarbonisation goals, but then as things develop, as the budget starts to firm, the program starts to firm, and we start to look at the actual logistics of doing the work, often compromises have to be made. So I think it's very key to get a good team together right from the very start, have a very high level overview of the timeline with regard to how you implement the framework, specifically PAS 2038, and ensuring that there's enough time there for the specialists to carry out their functions, to make the assessments, to provide that to the client. Often a lot of these interventions can be quite difficult to assess in the sense that there's a lot of engineering knowledge that goes into it, and it has to be made very simple so the clients can understand it. I've had instances where we've had recommendations for the HVAC to be improved, but not for the insulation of the building. So it means that you've got HVAC systems that will work far better and be far more efficient, but it's still leaking through the building. And I've had instances where we've improved, for example, lighting control, which is great. Obviously, it means that we could focus on daylight saving, we could focus on occupancy sensing, but what we haven't done is looked at swapping out the fluorescents for LEDs. So there's a number of these things that go really well in tandem. There's synergies between some of these interventions. And I think all of that has to be looked at holistically, giving enough time for that assessment, planning and implementation. And then the final step is sort of the evaluation piece, which is an ongoing piece post-completion.
Thanks, Stephen. There's a couple of bits there that we'll probably drop into a little bit more detail in later on as well. Thank you for that first part as well, guys. So we've got our first main audience poll question for today. It hopefully will help us guide the conversation. So it's another one with a 1 to 4 scale. What's your level of confidence and understanding of your organization's net zero strategy? We know that everybody will have one, but how well do you understand it is the big question for today. And looking at the answers coming in, we've got a wide variety of responses already coming in. So that'll be interesting to gauge. I'll just get another 10 seconds on that, and then we will, if we can close the poll now, please. So again, we've got a few people saying that they're pretty confident in their strategy, but it's interesting to see that nearly quick maths, that's 39%. They're saying that kind of below average understanding of their organization's net zero strategy, which does show that there is still a bit of a challenge there to overcome. So Matt has been waiting very patiently, very quietly in the corner. We'll put this question to you first, Matt, but I'd like to bring in Stephen on this one as well. This was a conversation that when we had a bit of a pre-meet on this, we were chatting about this back and forth for about 25 minutes. So we're trying to keep it a little bit less than that today. But what needs to be considered in that balance between sustainability and cost in a decarbonisation project? Stephen already alluded to the challenges that the public sector has with budgets. So what are those key considerations in that balance?
I think the first starting point for us is normally when we engage with a client, we find that their view on it is that sustainability costs them more money. And I think the first thing we need to do is really remove that myth, because there's lots of ways, particularly when you're looking at the furniture, that sustainability actually equals better value when you're looking at procurement. So some of the ways that we try and illustrate this is to explain if we're looking at a local supply chain, for example, which you really need to be doing if you're going to be procuring in a sustainable way. That supply chain being local to the project means that transport costs are minimized. You're not paying import duties and things, bringing things in from overseas. So all of that equates to a lower product cost. Also, if you're looking at remanufactured furniture, which is something that we're regularly pushing our clients to do, that is on average about 30% cheaper than new items. So a really good example for that would be if you're looking at a task chair. Task chairs can really go on, and half the reason they're changed is because they get worn out on the bits where people sit. But the actual mechanism on the bottom is perfectly usable from one project to the next. So it is possible to source refurbished task chairs at a fraction of the price. And because they're refurbished, they effectively look like new. There are some challenges around that, and we try and help our clients to mitigate them. So obviously you can't just assume that what you want is available on the market at the right point to suit your project. So we have a number of partners that we work with that offer remanufactured furniture, and at the point that we need to, we will then go to market to assess what's available and then put those options in front of the client. But I think that's just two small examples of ways we can do it. But ultimately, I think sustainable choices don't necessarily mean that you're going to be paying more for the product.
Stephen, is that the case in your experience?
Yeah, I think so. And also with regard to the whole sustainability versus cost, so we do a lot of public sector work. We also do a lot of private sector work, but for sort of tier one landlords. So with the tier one landlords, they're quite well aligned with government guidance and with government schemes. And they always want to sort of push the envelope. And as I said, you've got the government, which is sort of following very slightly behind on the target. So we're able to use some of our private sector experience with some of the public sector schemes. And one of the things that we found, especially with regard to funding, is there's really clever ways in which you can assist the decarbonisation effort. So we've had schemes where we've looked at the HVAC systems and their end of life. So when we look at upgrading them, you don't have to solely obtain that funding from the decarbonisation fund. You could also look at it at obtaining some of that from the maintenance fund. We've done stuff where we've replaced insulation and it has fire-rated properties as well as insulating properties. So once again, you don't stress that decarbonisation fund as much. You're able to get that from other funds. And there's a number of similar ways in which you could be really clever with how you do things. And I think for us, that's one of the things that we look at with regard to sustainability versus cost. There's clever ways to look at it where you could draw an experience from a number of different interventions and schemes that you've been on and really think about how best to get the end goal for the client. And typically what I would say as well is that there's sort of 3 levels of interventions that we look at, 1 being optimization, 2 being light retrofit, which might be swapping out of fluorescents for LEDs, like I mentioned earlier. And then 3 is sort of more heavy retrofit, like swapping a roof out. The thing is, you don't need to go straight to the heavy retrofit for massive gains. If you do have a building that is very old and does have extremely leaky windows, adding secondary glazing, which I would consider a light intervention, depending on the nature of the building, can save you masses of money with regard to which intervention you go for, but have a significant carbon reduction cost. So all of those things, being clever with the funds and where you get the money from, being clever with what interventions you go for, all of those play a part in managing the whole sustainability versus cost.
Thank you both. Some really good insights there from our panel thus far. I will stay with you for this one as well, Stephen, because it's something that you kind of touched on earlier, talking about that engagement, early engagement, both with the client and also with the wider design team. So what are the benefits of that early engagement, and also leaning on, fit out companies and their expertise?
Okay, so I would say, so specific, I'll be quite specific. I'll try and be brief as well to let John have a go as well. With regards to cast contracts specifically, one of the things that we've done is we have a sort of a group of people that we work with day in and day out with regard to the decarbonisation scheme. So we work quite closely with the likes of Coda and Katie Clements-Jackson, who's a sort of heading up the UK GBC from a technical standpoint. And we've got a number of suppliers and a number of consultants that we work with day in, day out. Often what we found with these schemes is you get the right people with the right expertise, but every time it's a different group of people. It's a different M&E consultant, it's a different architect, it might be a different facade engineer, depending on what level of decarbonisation engineering you get into. We've sort of been involved in multiple schemes that require lots of specialists, and everyone has the expertise, everyone has the knowledge. There's a framework, so everyone should be able to come together and work together well, and often it does. One of the things that we do, by having that familiarity of the partners we work with, it's just literally a case of being able to sort of fit together like hand in glove. So by engaging us early, even if the client didn't have much of an idea of how to progress, we can move quite quickly and at speed. And I think that with us having our dedicated group of partners, it works quite well because of that speed. And with engaging the fit out company specifically, there's a massive element of risk reduction. So one of the things we do is we allow access to the market. So designs can be put forward. You can put forward strategies on how to mitigate the impact of the intervention on the building, especially when it's live, maybe a school, hospital, etc. But once you gain access to the market, both from a cost perspective, as well as a buildability perspective, program perspective, all of that is really decided and concluded by that market access. And that element of engaging with us and allowing us to be on that journey means that when we input into the program, we're then bound to achieve it. So it helps de-risk that. When we input into the cost, we're then bound to achieve it. So what we found is on the schemes where we are consulted very early, we're able to make massive contributions to pretty much every facet of it. And it has led to those projects being able to be achieved on program to budget, based on the fact that we've got the market access and we could do a huge amount to help almost every stage of that journey.
John, interested to hear your views on this one as well, actually.
Yeah, I think, and lessons learned from our experience over the last few years, is the earlier the engagement, the better. And this might seem counterintuitive, but I would advocate engagement before a scheme emerges, particularly for companies with multiple assets, or organisations with multiple assets. If you wait until the scheme already has a brief and an intention that might be beyond retrofit, it's almost too late. And so early engagement, actually, you can formulate the brief, you can formulate a strategy for all of your stock. You can be aligned for funding opportunities that arise and then offset some of the costs. And you can benefit from the idea that the fit out company has if you like, a ready market of consultants who you'll already be familiar with because of the early engagement. And you'll be able to deliver, I think, a far more coherent scheme. And an interesting point just raised was about working with live buildings. The more early engagement you have, the less disruption to the workings of those buildings.
Yeah, much to be discussed there, I think, as well, in terms of moving on to our next question, which is you mentioned strategy there, John. What should public sector clients be considering when it comes to creating that retrofit strategy?
I think it starts with why. So why are we creating a retrofit strategy? It may be, and this would be a valid reason, just as a response to government restrictions or government interventions. I mean, government very much carrot and stick. They give you the stick first and tell you what you've got to do by when, and then the carrot might be funding, or it might be generating the past 2038 system as a guidance mechanism. But the other reason might be because you want lower running costs, you want your tenants to stay for longer, you want to improve the environment. There's a lot of reasons to do that, include the obvious ones, but also including your own profiles. And I think to start with the retrofit strategy, you need to map your starting point. You need to understand what your buildings are like now, where they are, what condition they're in. And then you need to map your endpoint and see whether that aligns with government targets or goes higher. It can't go lower. But the key thing is, and I see this so much in housing, because the housing retrofit market's more mature, particularly big social providers have considered retrofit to be initially a strand on its own, and it isn't. We're not just retrofitting buildings. We're including the retrofit within planned maintenance, within extensions, within repairs. And this retrofit strategy, I think, should really align any of your planned investment over the next 5, 10, 15 years through to the lifetime of the strategy. The thing that doesn't get mentioned much, which I think ought to be considered at strategic stage, is what the embodied carbon of your buildings are. We could all reach net zero by knocking our buildings down and building net zero buildings, but that would hardly be the spirit of what we're trying to do. And I think we've always got to think of the building occupants as well. And so the retrofit strategy shouldn't be static, it shouldn't be empirical, it shouldn't be just relating to the buildings themselves. It's about the use of the buildings and about the change of use of buildings. If we're using less office buildings now, and we may well be, what are those buildings going to become? How much do we want to invest in them now? And what do we want to turn them into in the future? So I think I just want to bookend that by saying you don't need a fully comprehensive retrofit strategy before you do any works. In fact, it'll probably be wrong if that's the case. You need to engage in works and reflect in them. And the retrofit strategy is something that builds and something that changes over time and something that evolves.
Stephen, I see you nodding along there. Is that tallying with your experiences?
Yeah, 100%. I think John, right at the start, hit the nail on the head where the client identifying what is really important to them, what is the key driver, is absolutely vital. We've had instances where we've hit the energy use intensity target, but to do that, we had to remove too much of the net lettable space, and there wouldn't have been a huge amount of space or the required space available. But it was an iterative process to get to that. And I think when we did sort of lessons learned and the debrief, we discovered that had we have known, and that's the sort of royal we, the team, had that have been something that was discerned right at the very beginning, then there would have been a different way to assess and to look at how we achieve the goal. So like John said, 100% identifying what are the key drivers is fundamental. It's literally step one.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much, guys. We're just about halfway through our time today, and we are getting through the questions quite rapidly. So we'll bring up the next poll just to inform this kind of final 3 or 4 questions for the webinar today. So, in your experience, does price take precedence over decarbonisation goals when procuring your projects? Got around 15 seconds left for you to vote on that. So there's all the time, most of the time, rarely or never. Quite interesting to see one of those has 0% on the response. So if you could close the poll now, please. And as you'll see on the screen there, a whopping sort of 87% of people saying either most of the time or all of the time price takes precedent over decarbonisation goals. I mean, that just shows the scale of the challenge and the scale of the mountain that lays in front of us if we're going to be reaching those goals. It's that understanding that, as Matt was touching onto, that sustainability doesn't necessarily always cost more, but obviously there's a perception that it does. Speaking of Matt, we're time to bring him back in, isn't it? Furniture, how can that help you achieve sustainability goals?
Well, the short answer is it can help a lot. So if we're looking at a fit out project, on average, furniture accounts for about 20% of the carbon footprint on an office fit out. So it's obviously a significant factor that needs to be considered. And just to sort of echo the previous comments from Stephen and John, I think the key thing we do at the start of the process is to really understand what the client's goals are. And that really helps us to move forward and help them achieve their ultimate goals. For example, there's a number of different accreditations that our clients are now trying to achieve, such as SCAR Gold or BREEAM. When we're working as part of the larger team on a turnkey project, that really does take quite a big precedent. So we normally start by engaging a specialist to carry out pre-assessments on the project, to actually identify what's required for us to get the relevant credits on each of the individual accreditations. We can then use that information to advise the clients as to what would be required for you to get these, which gives them, and it allows them to have an informed informed information that they can then use to pick the relevant accreditation they want to do. From them, we'll normally we'll develop a procurement strategy, and that procurement strategy will often involve reuse and a mixture of new furniture, especially if we're relocating clients from previous sites. So we've just done a project for a client where they're M&A business model, so they acquired a few businesses. They ended up with 4 different sites in London, and they wanted to amalgamate all of those businesses onto one new site. So they had quite a large amount of furniture available for reuse. So we undertook an audit to actually gauge what they had available, and then we created a plan which eventually saved them over £1 million by reusing as much of that furniture as we could. And so I think it can really help to not only achieve sustainability goals, but also help with the budget as well, and make sure that they can spend money on other areas rather than wasting it on furniture that they've already got. But I think that one of the key things there around reuse is that most of the carbon on the footprint on furniture is used during manufacturing. That's where it comes from. So I think that's quite a key piece of advice that we're giving our clients to actually reuse what they can, rather than procuring everything as new.
Yeah, thanks, Matt. Just a reminder for everybody watching that you can get your own questions in. As say, we're getting through the questions that we've already lined up to chat to the panelists with, but there is going to be time at the end for you to get your questions in. We already have had a few in, so probably best to get them in as soon as possible if you want to make sure that our team gets a chance to answer them. You can submit those through the Q&A box, which should be at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Go back to Matt actually for this next question, but also let's get Stephen's views on it as well. So does splitting out the FF&E package from the main construction procurement drive better value?
I think in some instances, it's perceived to do that. I think especially when it's put into a competitive tender, and obviously you're pitching people against each other. And if the primary deciding factor is price, then quite often you will get a perceived better value by doing that. But I think ultimately, if we're looking at project value in a holistic sense, is quite often the other way. So the advantage of putting the furniture into a complete turnkey D&B package, for example, is that we work really closely with our design and construction teams to actually specify the package and deliver it. So going back to my previous points around those accreditations, if you're looking at SCAR as an example, credits are achieved across the build of the project, but also with the furniture. So we can look to combine the whole package to achieve the overall goal, without necessarily compromising on anything that the client wants to compromise on. So I think if you're looking at value as a whole, there's definitely more to it than just financial value, which is what a lot of people perceive value as. One of the other things that we can do as well with early engagement, and going back to that piece, when we're working with our design team, if they've got a number of meeting rooms which they're looking to incorporate into the scheme, instead of building those meeting rooms, we can actually advise them on flexible partition systems, or even meeting pods, which are quite popular now, which we can source from furniture suppliers, and we can actually get that embedded into the design at an early stage, which is better for the client, because then if they're looking at a 5 to 10 year occupation and then they want to move, or they want to reconfigure the space mid-occupation, they obviously don't have to then dismantle these meeting rooms and effectively rebuild them. They can just move the pods around and reconfigure them. So I think that's something that if we weren't doing it at the early stage, and this is a complete package, it would be much more difficult to implement midway through the design process. So I think there's lots of areas where we can add value by incorporating it as one complete turnkey package.
Stephen, interested to hear the contractor view on this.
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, Matt did explain it quite well with regard to there are some benefits when you do tender something competitively, and there are also some benefits when you sort of single source it. Sort of linking to this question and the previous question, I think with regard to when you do single source it, it does allow for the contractor to focus primarily on what the client wants, and not to necessarily worry about being undercut by another party. Or, for example, we've been in particular tender situations where we know that the products that we've provided are all from Europe. All of the supply chain has been vetted. We have all of their information and sort of custody information. We know that they're carbon neutral, or at very least they've got a net zero pathway, because there's a PQQ process that we go through with all of our suppliers to ensure that they're on the same journey that we're on. And I think from that perspective, it really does mean that when you do single source it, we're able to focus more on the sustainability and on the quality aspect, where sometimes, especially if it's not a well-defined tender and it's a bit open to selection, then that can lead to others potentially offering something that commercially is more viable to the project, but actually doesn't hit the sustainability goals that we were aiming for. And I think, as we saw from the poll results most recently, you know, a lot of the time cost does play a big part in the project. So it's really being mindful of ensuring that the integrity of what is offered isn't compromised. But both pathways can work really well, and we've been successful on both pathways, and we've seen it managed very, very well in public sector scenarios. So it's just making sure that the right boxes are ticked. And Matt mentioned remanufactured. That's always a very good path to go down. And you know, we've done the same thing, where we've gone to and looked at existing furniture, inventoried it, identified what could be reused, what can't be reused, and you know, work with Material Index on providing a place to reuse it completely separate from the project that we're working on, or reusing it in the project or in a different scheme related to the project. So there's very clever ways of working with the client when it is single sourced, and it can be tendered. Of course, it can. It's just needs to be very clearly defined, so everyone's bound to that high quality.
Thanks, Stephen. This one is, I think this is a fairly general question in the sense of the changes we've seen to workspaces post-COVID. But Matt, I'd be interested to hear more from you on what changes have we seen to the workspace kind of fit out market, and what are the things that you're seeing on that kind of coal face that you're bringing to it. What are you seeing in this post-COVID world, as we're now calling it?
I think there's been a lot of activity post-COVID as companies adjust to life as it is now, so to speak. I mean, from a furniture perspective, I think there's a massive increase in the amount of furniture that goes into each fit out. So prior to COVID, it was probably more like 10 to 15% of the project spend was on furniture. It's now more like 30%, and I think a lot of that's been driven by a number of factors. I think there's a big increase in employee well-being, specifically with ergonomic products and the good quality products. So workstations now, we're setting those up. They're more often than not height adjustable. Most of the projects we're working on, task chairs, we're seeing a lot more call for mid to high range spend on task chairs, for example. I also think that neurodiversity is quite a key thing now. So with workplaces, they're not just looking for your old typical call center, as we get it referred to quite a bit. You know, a modern office is more than that. There's a lot of different work settings to suit different people. It's not just desking. There's touchdown collaboration areas. There's areas within the office where people can go to actually work as project teams, for example, rather than just working individually. And I think one of the major changes we've seen is the call for smaller meeting spaces as well. Obviously, COVID created a big drive towards Zoom and Teams meetings. So in the office now, there's a lot of solo meeting spaces, which we tend to put in as a furniture solution for all of the reasons I mentioned before, because they are an asset that can be reused. So I think that's quite a major change for us. And then obviously there's a call to then attract and retain staff as well. I think the market's it's quite tough out there if you're trying to recruit people. So, you know, employees don't just want to come into an office, they want to come into a destination which they can enjoy, and they expect more from it than just a place to work. And that's led to a different specification of furniture as well. We're seeing trends come from resi markets and hospitality markets and making their way into the workplace, which is quite refreshing.
Thanks, Matt. Some really great insights there. What we'll do is we'll touch on, this is our final question of the pre-prepared things before we get into our audience questions. And I'd like to get the views of each and every one of you, because I feel like you can all bring something different to that. We'll start with John, because we've not heard from John for a little while. But how can we utilize technology to kind of track and manage decarbonisation, and maybe some examples from your experience?
I think there are probably three areas we can focus on, and the first is the preparation area. Any building, you know, from housing upwards, could really have an accompanying BIM model, building information model, or digital twin, if it's an existing building, and that gives us insight into the spaces available, the construction of the building. We can use those models alongside modeling software, energy modeling software like IES, for example, where we can model the occupancy plus the energy needed to heat the building. We can model cold bridging and so on, and that becomes useful. And the technology really now allows us to do this live. So you can do this with your client and discuss different options, and it becomes a design tool rather than a kind of post-design tool. And given the changes in legislation around Building Safety Act and around CDM, PDBR, I think there are going to be requirements for this technology anyway. It's great for fit out companies, by the way, because once you've got a model of the building, if you want to change the building, you've already got the model. And for me, that's a starting point. The second is empirical, which is how do you know your retrofit's any good? You know, you've had somebody design it and manage it and build it, but are you using less energy? And if not, why not? Have you got any unintended consequences from change in ventilation? So we can, the sensors are available and relatively low cost to tell you that your building's doing the right thing. And then the third thing is obviously the extension of that is control. We waste so much energy just not turning lights off, for example, when people aren't in rooms. And this should be ubiquitous, but lots of buildings I see have no control, no person detection, and so on. And again, these controls now are so good that we can control temperatures and ventilation in rooms when they're unoccupied. And we can distribute ventilation and heat exchange throughout buildings, particularly large buildings that are used in different ways. So I'd say that 3 key elements for me, and a BIM model, particularly if you put a 4D element to that. So you don't see that as a static model that can encompass and in-house your retrofit strategy. And you can see how the building progresses over time. And then the measurement, and then the operation.
Stephen, anything to add from you on that?
I think as time goes on, we will, even right now, data is hugely important with regard to the data that the building collects on how it operates. There's good data and bad data. Sometimes you need to look at the sources of the data, how it's being processed and managed, and like John said, what then happens with it? Why is it? How is it interrogated? Why aren't we achieving what we're meant to be achieving? But I think, especially with retrofit, one thing that I believe will be absolutely key is making the buildings smarter. So focusing on the EMS systems, the BMS systems, and just sort of the smart building systems in general. I think we all know how important data is, and just going forward with the rise of AI and being able to gain lots of information from various buildings and crunch those numbers, so we could all learn from how buildings operate and then feed that back into sort of new frameworks and new guidance. Looking at making buildings smarter will be absolutely key. So, a brand new build will obviously, typically be bigger and better. It's like a younger sibling where they sort of end up being taller than you and more handsome, but they don't have to be smarter than you. And I think it's just one of those things where when we look at smart spaces, for example, we've worked with them and they've monitored occupancy across a multitude of floors and then fed that information back, so we know at what time people leave. And then if maybe we find that there's a particular floor where someone remains for, we find out that the lights are being left on till very late in the night, we could investigate that, find out that it's actually 1 or 2 people, and then we could look at potentially changing behaviors there. Is it a case that rather than if it's a tenant taking multiple floors, do they both go to the same area? Do they work from home? How can you change behaviors? And behavior is actually seen as one of the optimization interventions, because usually it should be quite an easy implementation if people are willing to. So having that granular detail. Matt mentioned before about the wear and tear of furniture. So once again, there's sensors that you can apply to desk positions where you could see how often that desk specifically is being used. So when we look at the wear and tear of furniture, we might think that some furniture weathers the storm a lot better than others, but maybe it's the frequency of use. Now, I don't believe that every single retrofit will be able to go down to a super granular level of detail, but the technology is there. And I think embracing that as much as we can, mining that data is step one, making sure that it's coming in, then sifting through it to take the useful bits from it is step 2. And then interpreting that is step 3. And then introducing the change based on what we found is step 4. But I'll just say in general, John very much went into the engineering element and the technology to ensure that what you have works quantitatively, and it ticks that box. And there's a lot of information that can then be fed back, smart information on usage and application, which can then help optimize how we use buildings and how we think about construction.
And finally, Matt, how can we utilize technology to track decarbonisation?
Yeah, it's a slightly different angle on it. So one of the things we're looking at the moment is how we can work better with BIM. So we're designing a lot of our projects in Revit now, and that's something that we're ramping up. I think generally the industry is gearing up towards that. One of the key things from a furniture perspective is that we're able to actually insert information onto the Revit model as to where the furniture's come from. So when we're looking at reuse and remanufactured items, we can insert those into the model as a legacy product, and we can actually adjust the tagging on that product to explain where it's come from. So if it's come from a previous site, we can put that in there. If it's quite often we do a lot of repeat work with clients as well. So if it's if that item's come from a fit out we did previously, we can actually put the procurement information from that previous fit out into the tag. And I think then combining that with asset tracking software as well. So we do have the option to put QR codes underneath each product, which then allows facilities managers to then quickly identify what that product is, where it's come from, who they need to contact if they want to get it reupholstered or if they need a spare part. So I think the role technology is playing in that sense is really, really important for us, because it makes it very easy for people to come back to us and say, instead of just replacing the product, just say, we've got this issue, can you fix it? And that's something that we're doing quite a lot of now.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much to all three of you for your responses to those pre-submitted questions. We'll wrap those up now with our final poll before going into just under 10 minutes of audience questions. So just to wrap us up, how aware are you now as an audience of the different ways to decarbonise your estate through effective estates management? Just leave that to run for a few more minutes. Yeah, if we could just wrap that poll now, please. Excellent. So more good signs there. Only 9% have stayed in that not being particularly aware. So I think you've done a pretty good job there, guys, as a panel of building a bit of public sector knowledge there in terms of effective estates management and how you can decarbonise through it. So we're going to move on to a couple of audience questions now. We've only got, say, around 8 minutes left, so we'll try and get through as many of these as possible. We'll put this one to you, Stephen. It's come from a mysterious anonymous attendee. How do you find that decarbonisation differs working in occupied buildings to those that are sort of speculative vacant retrofit?
Occupied speak. Well, I think with regard to the implementation of the measures, typically with an occupied building, it just takes a significant amount of planning, consideration of how the building is used, and also just engagement with the supply chain. So I think it's a case of engaging all the stakeholders, the building manager, the tenants, or the users, whether it be children at schools, patients in the hospitals, the security, and it's just compartmentalizing the endeavor. So we've had instances where we've taken out sections of a building, and we've had to temporarily enable their ability to see patients in another location while we do the work that we do. And I think that just the level of sheer engagement that is involved in doing that, we are trying to improve their or decrease their carbon emissions, and that is a very important endeavor. But how they use the building, whether it be for education or health, that to them is the most important thing. And working with the consultants very closely to come up with a design that we're able to execute well in stages, and a strategy is absolutely key. So someone like John, who would often think about not just a case of what's the end result, but how do we get there, working along with us, that works very well. But it's just a significant difference between working in an occupied space and a vacant space. And that's where the early engagement comes in, pays huge dividends, because a lot of these assets are not straightforward. they do have complications, sometimes due to age, sometimes due to building use, sometimes due to the sheer number of stakeholders. We've had that where you get conflicting priorities, and it's just a case of managing all that. And in occupied buildings, that does become very much amplified. So with regard to the difference between the two, I would say that occupied buildings typically would involve significantly high levels of planning and collaboration between the various parties of the project team and all the sort of extended stakeholders.
Excellent. Well, I'll put this this next question to you, John. It won't have escaped anyone's notice. There's been a change of government in the last sort of 8 weeks or so. There were at the back end of the Conservative government, there's a significant rowing back on some of the promises around net zero. What are you kind of hearing or seeing within the market as to what the general feeling is around a new government and what that potentially means for this kind of net zero drive?
So I think that the general movement is very much back to probably where we were when Johnson was Prime Minister. He was quite an environmentalist for a Prime Minister, and he set some fairly high standards. And it's only the last 2 years they've been rowed back, and I can see us moving really back to that position where the sector as a whole won't necessarily be funded, but there will be enough funding to build the knowledge, build the technology, and build the infrastructure and supply chain. So I think we've moved in a positive direction. I noticed, I'm going to be apolitical here, but I noticed there was a rowing back of Labour intentions before they were elected. We had high hopes that this 26 billion would be forthcoming, and that could have made that would have changed the industry, I think. Whether there is a stealthy move back to that or not remains to be seen, but I'm heartened that we're back to the relatively good place we were in 3 years ago, and I'm heartened that we're not all going to be just beaten with the stick, and the carrot is going to be there for us.
I'll leave that one there for anyone to chip in with any further political insight. That John's tried to done a very good job remaining apolitical there. But
I could add probably. I work quite closely with DESNZ, and the mood around the place is back to where it was when things were going quite well. So I think we're moving back in the right direction.
Excellent. I'll tell you what, we'll end on a nice positive note there. And so thank you very much to everybody who's tuned in today. Unfortunately, that is all we've got time for. So thank you very much to you guys in the audience, but also thanks to Matt, to Stephen, and to John for joining us on the panel today. A really, really excellent panel with a good diversity of views on there as well. Now, everyone in attendance is part of the Pagabo Live community now. You've signed up, so you'll all receive a link automatically for our next session if you haven't already, which is in September. The details of that are on the screen right now. We're talking about decarbonisation of public sector leisure facilities. There's also a newsletter coming out, which comes out around a week or so after each of our Pagabo Live sessions. There's a recording of the webinar in there, in video and podcast form, just in case you really want to listen to us on your kitchen Alexa, along with further insights from the team. So hopefully you've enjoyed today, found it very useful. If you have, tell a friend, tell a colleague, and we'll be back next month for our next session.